Imagine you're a soldier in 1939. You're getting ready to face the most modern, mechanized army the world has ever seen. You've trained for this, steeled yourself for the brutal reality of war. You're handed your new weapon, the tool that will be your last line of defense in the up-close chaos of combat. And it's this, a crude, featureless steel spike. It has no sharpened edge for cutting, no handle for a desperate grip, just a brutally simple 8-inch sharpened point. British soldiers, used to elegant bladed weapons, called it the Pigsticker, and they were utterly horrified. So why, on the brink of a modern war, would Great Britain deliberately arm its men with a weapon that looked like it belonged in the Middle Ages? The answer isn't simple. It reveals a hidden story of industrial desperation, a forgotten philosophy of battlefield psychology, and a brutal calculation where mass production and the power of fear were deemed far more important than a finely sharpened edge. This is the strange story of the No. 4 Spike Bayonet, a weapon born of crisis, hated by its users, and yet one that would prove surprisingly effective in the crucible of World War II. To understand the birth of this crude spike, we have to go back to the Britain of the late 1930s. The air was thick with anxiety and denial. The Munich Agreement of 1938, which Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain had hailed as securing peace for our time, had really just kicked the can down the road. Adolf Hitler's Germany was rearmed and spoiling for a fight. Its military, the Wehrmacht, was a terrifyingly modern force built around the revolutionary concept of Blitzkrieg, lightning war, using fast-moving tanks and overwhelming air support. When Germany invaded the rest of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, any illusion of peace was shattered. War was no longer a possibility, it was a certainty. For Britain, this was a moment of crisis. The decade after the Great War had been one of military neglect and economic depression. The public was staunchly anti-war, and the armed forces had been starved of funds. The British Army especially was a shadow of its former self. While the Royal Navy was still a global power, and the RAF was scrambling to build the Spitfires and Hurricanes that would save the nation in 1940, the Army was small, under-equipped, and trained on the doctrines of the last war. The huge citizen armies of 1918 were gone, their equipment scrapped or sold. Now, with the clock ticking down to September 1939, Britain faced the monumental task of rearming from an almost standing start. This wasn't just about training men, it was an industrial challenge of staggering proportions. Britain's factories weren't ready for the demands of total war. The specialized tools, skilled labor, and raw materials needed to produce millions of rifles, machine guns, and tanks simply weren't available overnight. Every decision the War Office made had to be weighed against a stark equation of time, cost, and industrial capacity. The enemy wasn't just the German war machine, but the clock itself. There was no time for perfection and no budget for elegance. The only thing that mattered was producing functional, reliable equipment on an unimaginable scale and getting it into the hands of soldiers fast. It was in this pressure cooker of imminent war that the long, storied history of the British sword bayonet would come to an abrupt and brutal end. For over 30 years, the standard bayonet of the British Army had been the pattern 1907. It was, in many ways, the classic sword bayonet and a magnificent piece of military hardware. With a serious 17-inch blade, a beautifully crafted wooden grip, and a complex crossguard, the P-1907 was a direct descendant of the bladed weapons that had dominated infantry combat for centuries. It was more than just a rifle attachment, it was a short sword in its own right, a symbol of the British Empire's martial prowess. Veterans of the Great War knew its weight and balance intimately, and it was a weapon that commanded respect. Fixed to the iconic Lee-Enfield rifle, it created a fearsome pike over 5.5 feet long, giving the British Tommy a significant reach advantage in a grim trench raid. But the very things that made the pattern 1907 so impressive were also its greatest weaknesses in 1939. It was a product of a different age of manufacturing, an era of skilled artisans and peacetime production.
Each P-1907 was a minor work of industrial art. The blade alone required high-quality steel and a complex process of forging, hardening, and grinding to create its fuller, that groove down the center, and its razor-sharp edge. The crossguard and grips were intricately machined and carved from walnut. All of this took dozens of manufacturing steps, specialized machinery, and most importantly, the hands of skilled armorers who were in desperately short supply. As Britain's rearmament program kicked into high gear, planners ran headlong into this industrial bottleneck. The main government arms factories, like the Royal Small Arms Factory at Enfield, were already running flat out just to produce the rifles and Bren guns that were so urgently needed. There was simply no spare capacity to mass produce a complex weapon like the P-1907 on the required scale. To equip an army that would soon swell to millions, they would need millions of bayonets. Trying to make that many pattern 1907s would have stolen critical resources, skilled labor, high-grade steel, and valuable machine hours from the production of far more vital weapons like artillery, tanks, and aircraft. The lessons of the Great War also loomed large. While the bayonet charge was an iconic image, the reality was that artillery and machine guns had been the great killers of the war. The bayonet's role, while psychologically significant, was changing. The long reach of the P-1907 was great in the open, but it could be clumsy in a narrow trench or a shelled-out building. Planners began to wonder if a long, beautifully made sword was truly necessary for a modern, fast-moving war. The problem was clear. The army needed a bayonet, but it couldn't afford the time, money, or industrial effort to produce its trusted pattern 1907. A new, ruthlessly pragmatic solution was needed. The design for a new bayonet was formally approved in November 1939, just 2 months into the war. It was for the new Lee-Enfield No. 4 Mark I rifle. A weapon itself was designed for faster mass production. This new bayonet was a radical departure from everything that had come before. It was the No. 4 Spike Bayonet, and it was the physical embodiment of wartime expediency. Stripped of every non-essential feature, it was little more than a steel rod with a socket on one end and a sharpened point on the other. The blade itself was just 8 inches long. It had no cutting edge, no wooden grips, no crossguard. It was designed for one purpose: to be made as quickly and cheaply as possible by anyone, anywhere. The design was a masterpiece of industrial minimalism. The search for a P-1907 replacement had been going on for years, and the Spike concept was seen as the most logical path. Its genius was its sheer simplicity. It could be produced using basic metalworking techniques, requiring none of the complex forging or precision machining of a sword bayonet. This meant the government could bypass the overwhelmed arms factories and give contracts to a huge range of civilian firms that had never made a weapon before. Suddenly, companies famous for peacetime products were churning out bayonets by the tens of thousands. The most famous was the Singer Manufacturing Company in Scotland, world-renowned for its sewing machines. They weren't alone. Textile machinery producers and even the automotive parts giant Joseph Lucas all turned their industrial might to producing these simple spikes. To hide the locations of these new arms factories from enemy spies, the government assigned each one a secret dispersal code instead of a company name. The evolution of the No. 4 bayonet throughout the war is a story of ever-increasing simplification. The very first model, the Mark I, was actually a relatively well-made cruciform spike with 4 grooves milled into the blade. But even this was considered too complex. Only about 75,000 were made before the design was simplified. The Mark II became the most common version. It did away with the milled grooves, replacing the cruciform blade with a simple, round, sharpened spike. This eliminated a whole stage of manufacturing. An even simpler version, the Mark II Asterisk, was introduced where the blade and socket were forged as 2 separate pieces and then crudely welded together. Finally, the pinnacle of crude simplicity was the Mark III. Produced by Joseph Lucas, this version was fabricated from 7 individual pieces of stamped sheet steel, all welded together to form the socket. Painted black to hide the rough welds, the Mk3 was the ultimate expression of wartime necessity. It was ugly, but it could be stamped out in enormous quantities by unskilled workers. This industrial strategy was a resounding success. Nearly 5 million Spike Bayonets were produced in Britain alone. The production was also global, with Canada producing over 900,000 and the American company, Savage Stevens, making another 1.25 million to supply the UK. The industrial reality was undeniable. Britain could produce dozens of these simple spikes for every one pattern 1907 it might have attempted to make. They had their bayonet in the millions. Now they just had to convince the soldiers to use it. The reaction from the men who were issued the new No. 4 Spike Bayonet was immediate and overwhelmingly negative. For the British Tommy, who took pride in his equipment, this crude spike was an insult. It felt less like a weapon and more like something from a blacksmith's shed. Soldiers who had trained with the elegant pattern 1907 or heard their fathers' stories of using it in the Great War looked at the 8-inch spike with disbelief and disgust.
Nicknames appeared almost immediately, and none of them were complimentary. The Pigsticker was the one that stuck, perfectly capturing its brutish agricultural look. Others called it a tent peg or the screwdriver, mocking its complete lack of utility. And this was a critical point for the average soldier. A bayonet wasn't just a weapon of last resort, it was an essential multi-tool. A German soldier's bayonet was an excellent utility knife, and Americans could be used for cutting wire or clearing brush. The old pattern 1907 with its long blade could be used to toast bread over a fire or probe for mines. There was even a belief among some officers that the new Spike Bayonet was designed just to stop soldiers from using their bayonets to open cans of bully beef. The Spike Bayonet could do none of these things. It couldn't cut, couldn't pry, and couldn't slice. Its only function was to poke a hole in someone. This lack of versatility was a constant complaint. A soldier now had to carry a separate knife for tasks his bayonet used to handle. It felt like a massive step backward, a piece of gear that ignored the practical realities of life on campaign. Beyond its uselessness as a tool, there was a deeper psychological rejection. To the soldiers, it looked and felt cheap. It lacked the martial grace and intimidating length of the sword bayonets used by their enemies. It felt like they were being sent to fight a modern war with a medieval relic. In a conflict where morale was a critical weapon, being issued something that felt so obviously inferior was a blow to their pride. The men couldn't see the strategic industrial logic behind it. They only saw what was in their hands, a short, ugly, and seemingly useless spike of steel. They hated it. What they didn't yet understand was the brutal philosophy behind its use. The story of this unloved weapon is a fascinating look into the hard realities of war. If you're finding this breakdown of military tech and history interesting, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We explore hidden stories like this every week. Your support helps us continue to bring them to light. Now, let's get back to the surprising effectiveness of the pointy end. While the soldiers saw a useless tool, the British War Office saw something else entirely. They saw a weapon perfectly suited for its one true purpose: killing. To understand this, we have to stop thinking of the bayonet as a multi-purpose knife and start thinking of it as an instrument of psychological warfare. From the Napoleonic era onward, military theorists knew the bayonet's greatest power wasn't the number of casualties it inflicted, but its ability to break an enemy's will to fight. The goal of a bayonet charge wasn't to fight a prolonged melee, but to generate so much fear that the defenders would break and run before you even got there. British doctrine, refined in the savage training camps of World War II, embraced this concept of cold steel. The training was designed to instill a ferocious, almost primal aggression. Soldiers were taught to scream and roar as they charged, to transform themselves from disciplined riflemen into terrifying, unstoppable forces.
The bayonet was the focal point of this transformation.
In this context, the spike's design made a terrifying kind of sense. A knife bayonet makes a slashing wound, but a spike creates a deep, penetrating puncture wound. These wounds are notoriously difficult for surgeons to clean and suture, leading to a much higher risk of infection. The cruciform shape of the original Mk1 was particularly feared for the complex wound channel it left. Furthermore, a spike had advantages in the chaos of a charge. A knife blade can get stuck between ribs or lodged in bone, taking precious seconds to wrench free. A simple, tapered spike, like an ice pick, could be thrust in and withdrawn with brutal efficiency. The lack of an edge was, in this scenario, a feature, not a bug. There was no temptation to slash. The only instinct was to thrust, the most direct and lethal way to use the weapon. The rifle and bayonet became a short spear, a weapon that humans have a primal fear of. Perhaps the most significant element of British doctrine was the order to keep bayonets fixed. Unlike American or German troops, who usually fixed bayonets right before a charge, it was common practice for British and Commonwealth soldiers to go into battle with the spike already mounted. This had a profound psychological effect. For the British Tommy, the glint of steel at the end of his rifle was a constant, physical reminder of his duty to close with the enemy. For the German soldier in his foxhole, the sight of an entire line of infantry advancing, each man with a spike on his rifle, was a deeply intimidating spectacle. It was a clear statement of intent: we are coming for you. The number 4 spike wasn't designed to be a useful tool. It was designed to be a terrifying threat. Despite the soldiers' initial hatred for the Pigsticker, it didn't take long for the weapon to prove its worth. When used as intended, as the sharp point of an aggressive charge, it proved devastatingly effective. One of the most legendary examples took place on Crete in May 1941. Allied forces, including Australian and New Zealand Anzac battalions, were in full retreat, exhausted after a week of intense fighting against elite German paratroopers. On May 27th, they formed a rear guard along a sunken road known as 42nd Street. As a battalion of crack German mountain troops advanced, the order was given, "Fix bayonets." The men of the New Zealand 28th Maori Battalion, renowned for their ferocity, began a traditional haka, a war cry that sent a spine-chilling roar across the olive groves. Then they charged. Yelling and screaming, the Anzacs surged over the embankment and crashed into the stunned Germans. The fighting was savage, hand-to-hand chaos. In the vicious melee, the short, handy bayonet weapon was ruthlessly effective. The charge was a staggering success. The German battalion was mauled, suffering an estimated 280 casualties, and was forced into a full retreat. The Battle of 42nd Street became a legend, a testament to the terrifying power of a determined bayonet charge. This wasn't an isolated incident. In the deserts of North Africa in 1942, during the breakout at Min Kakim, New Zealanders used bayonets to punch through Rommel's lines. Later that year, at the pivotal Second Battle of El Alamein, 2 Victoria Crosses, the highest award for gallantry, were awarded for actions involving bayonet charges. Private Percy Gratwick charged a German machine gun post, killing the crew with his rifle and bayonet. Private Stanley Gurney single-handedly took out 3 machine gun positions with grenades and his bayonet before he was killed. The reputation of the bayonet and the soldiers who wielded it became a weapon in itself. German troops learned to fear units known for their willingness to use cold steel, like the Canadians and the Anzacs. In the close quarters fighting of Normandy or the jungles of Burma, the psychological threat of the bayonet was ever present. The soldiers may have continued to curse it for its inability to open a tin of beef, but in the heat of battle,
the ugly, crude Pigsticker had earned a grudging, blood-soaked respect. While the British choice to adopt a Spike bayonet was radical, they weren't the only ones asking what a bayonet was for. Every major power in the war had its own answer, based on its own industrial capacity and military philosophy. Germany. The Third Reich armed its soldiers with the Seitengewehr 84/98, a superbly made knife bayonet for the Karabiner 98K rifle. It was shorter than the old British P1907, but was an incredibly versatile tool. German doctrine saw the bayonet more as a combination fighting knife and utility tool than a primary charging weapon. The United States. America entered the war with the long 16-inch M1905 sword bayonet. Experience quickly showed this was too unwieldy, and in 1943 they switched to the M1 bayonet with a shorter 10-inch blade. Like the Germans, the Americans valued utility. Their bayonets were always designed as functional knives. The Soviet Union. The most direct comparison to the British Spike was the bayonet for the Soviet Mosin Nagant rifle. The Red Army issued a long 17-inch cruciform spike that was even more extreme in its philosophy. Soviet doctrine often dictated the bayonet remain permanently fixed to the rifle. For the Soviet command, the rifle and bayonet were a single, inseparable weapon. This mirrored the British emphasis on the bayonet's psychological role, prioritizing its function as a short pike over any other use. France. Even before the war, the French had embraced simplicity with their MAS-36 rifle. It featured a spike bayonet stored in a tube under the barrel. To use it, a soldier just had to pull the bayonet out and reverse it into its socket. Viewed in this global context, the British No. 4 Spike no longer seems like such an oddity. It was part of a broader doctrinal split. On one side were nations like Germany and the US, who saw the bayonet as a multi-purpose knife. On the other were Britain and the Soviet Union, who saw it as a pure psychological piercing weapon, a successor to the medieval pike. Britain's choice was a deliberate one. So, back to the question, why did Britain arm its soldiers with a weapon that seemed to belong to a bygone era? The No. 4 Spike bayonet, the hated Pigsticker, was not a mistake. It was a calculated, brutally pragmatic solution to a complex set of problems. It's one of history's best examples of how the cold realities of industrial warfare can override everything else. The story of the Spike bayonet is a story of trade-offs. The War Office traded the elegance and utility of a sword bayonet for the sheer speed and volume of production that a simple spike allowed. They sacrificed the finely crafted weapon a soldier might love for the brutally effective weapon the nation could actually produce by the millions. Faced with an existential threat, they correctly realized that a good enough bayonet in every soldier's hand was infinitely better than a perfect bayonet for only a few. But it was also the triumph of a specific and terrifying battlefield philosophy. The No. 4 Spike wasn't designed to be a tool. It was designed to be a threat. It was the physical manifestation of a doctrine that prized psychological shock and aggressive momentum above all else. Its crude simplicity was its strength. It was a pure weapon, stripped of all pretense, dedicated to a single, savage purpose. In the desperate charges on Crete, in the dust of El Alamein, and in the hedgerows of Normandy, it proved that this philosophy was terrifyingly sound. In the end, the story of this horrifyingly simple bayonet reveals a profound truth about war. The most effective weapon isn't always the most advanced, the most beautifully crafted, or the most versatile. The most effective weapon is the one that best fits the unique industrial and doctrinal circumstances of its time. The No. 4 Spike bayonet was ugly, unloved, and utterly devoid of finesse, but it was cheap to make, available in the millions, and devastatingly effective when it mattered most. It was the right weapon for the right war at precisely the right time. Thank you for joining us for this look at the No. 4 Spike Bayonet. If you want to see more stories about the fascinating and often surprising history of military technology, please consider subscribing. And don't forget to check out our other videos, like this one on another misunderstood piece of wartime equipment. We'll see you next time.